Nestled among majestic mountains, the small village looked like a peaceful painting crafted by nature. Simple wooden houses were scattered across the hillsides, surrounded by lush green fields and crystal-clear streams that flowed gently. Every morning sunlight filtered through the trees, bathing the village in golden light and bringing a sense of tranquility rarely found elsewhere. But amidst this serene setting, there was a solitary wooden house on the edge of the village, where Thomas, an old war veteran, lived with his jet-black horse, Shadow. Thomas was a man who had endured many ups and downs in life. He had once been a brave soldier, fighting in fierce battles, but war had left not only scars on his body but also deep wounds in his soul. After losing his family in a tragic accident, Thomas decided to leave the city and retreat to this small village to live a quiet life. He built a modest wooden house, living in seclusion and avoiding the noise of the outside world. His only companion was Shadow, a black horse with intelligent, bright eyes. Shadow was no ordinary horse. From the moment Thomas first saw him at a small market, he sensed something special about the animal. Shadow was not only swift, but also possessed an unusual sensitivity, as if he could understand human emotions. Thomas, despite being a hardened man, couldn't resist the trusting gaze of Shadow and decided to bring him home. From that day on, Thomas and Shadow became inseparable companions. Every morning, Thomas would take Shadow to the nearby fields, where the horse could run freely across the lush green grass. In his free time, Thomas would sit beside Shadow, stroking his sleek black coat and recounting stories of his days in the war. He spoke of comrades who had sacrificed their lives, of the brutal battles, and of the lessons about loyalty he had learned throughout his life. "Shadow, you know," Thomas said in his deep, warm voice, "in war, loyalty is the most precious thing, not just between people, but also between humans and their companions like you. There were horses that saved soldiers' lives, and there were soldiers who gave their lives to protect their horses. That bond is unbreakable." Shadow, though unable to speak, seemed to understand every word Thomas said. The horse would stand still, ears perked up, his bright eyes shining as if he were listening intently. Sometimes, Shadow would let out a soft neigh, as if responding to Thomas's stories. This understanding made Thomas feel less lonely in his quiet life. The villagers also knew of Shadow and adored the horse. They often saw Shadow galloping through the narrow village paths, his strong legs and graceful movements like a gust of wind. The children in the village loved Shadow and would often bring him carrots or apples. Shadow, with his gentle nature, always accepted the treats happily and bowed his head as if to say thank you. But while they admired Shadow, the villagers found Thomas to be a difficult man to approach. He rarely spoke to anyone and only appeared when he needed to buy essentials. To them, Thomas was a mysterious figure, carrying stories no one dared to ask about. Despite his reclusive nature, Thomas never felt lonely. To him, Shadow was enough. The horse was not just a companion but a part of his family, a silent comrade who stood by him during these peaceful days. Every evening, as the sunset painted the sky red, Thomas would sit on the steps of his house, gazing at the distant mountains. Shadow stood beside him, his eyes fixed on the same horizon, as if they were sharing the same thoughts. "We're lucky, Shadow," Thomas said, his voice thoughtful. "The war took so much, but it couldn't take away this peace. And you're the best thing I have." Shadow let out a soft neigh, as if in agreement. The horse lowered his head, gently nudging Thomas's shoulder, a gesture full of love and understanding. Thomas smiled, a rare but genuine smile. In that moment, amidst the serene setting of the mountain village, Thomas felt he had found a place where he belonged, a place where he could spend the rest of his days in peace. But this peaceful life would not last forever. A great storm was silently brewing, bringing challenges that neither Thomas nor Shadow could foresee. And in the days of turmoil to come, Shadow's loyalty and courage would be tested, ultimately becoming a symbol not just for Thomas, but for the entire village. One day, the clear blue sky over the small village suddenly turned gray. Thick, dark clouds rolled in from the horizon, blocking out the sun and bringing with them a sense of unease. The wind began to blow fiercely, scattering dry leaves everywhere. The villagers, accustomed to the tranquility of the mountains, started to sense that something was wrong. The gusts of wind grew stronger, howling like a warning from nature about an impending disaster. Before long, the first drops of rain began to fall, light but chilling. Then the rain intensified, with heavy droplets pounding on rooftops, the ground, and the narrow village paths. The sound of the rain mixed with the howling wind, creating a chaotic symphony that shattered the usual calm. The villagers hurried to shut their windows, reinforce their roofs, and prepare for the storm. But no one could have predicted that this was no ordinary storm. The small river that ran through the village, usually calm and clear, began to rise. Water from the mountains poured in, carrying mud and broken branches. The once gentle stream turned into a raging torrent, sweeping away everything in its path. The villagers, though familiar with heavy rains, couldn't help but worry as the river rose rapidly. They began to talk about the possibility of a flash flood, a disaster the small village had never faced before. Meanwhile, in the wooden house on the edge of the village, Thomas sat by the window gazing out at the darkened sky. He could sense the storm's unusual intensity, but due to his old age and frail health, he couldn't do much to prepare. His wooden house, though sturdy, was far from an ideal shelter in the face of a flood. Thomas sighed, his eyes filled with worry. He glanced over at Shadow, the jet-black horse standing in the nearby stable, and reassured himself that everything would be fine. But things were far from fine. The rain grew heavier, the wind stronger, and the river water began to flood the village streets. The villagers scrambled to evacuate to higher ground, taking their families and essential belongings with them. But Thomas, living alone with no one to help him, couldn't leave his house. As the water began to flood his yard, he tried to stand up to check the situation, but his weak legs wouldn't allow him to move quickly. He could only sit there, helplessly watching the water rise inch by inch. Shadow, from inside the stable, sensed the danger. The horse wasn't like other animals, who would simply cower in fear and seek shelter. Shadow had a unique sensitivity, as if he could feel the threat approaching. When the water began to seep into the stable, Shadow let out a loud neigh, his powerful voice cutting through the sound of the rain and wind. The horse bolted out of the stable, running to the window of Thomas's house, pounding on the door with his hooves and neighing loudly, as if to warn him. Thomas, hearing Shadow's neighs, struggled to stand and move to the window. When he saw the water flooding his yard and rising rapidly, he realized the situation was far more serious than he had thought, but he didn't know what to do. In his current state, he couldn't leave the house on his own, and he couldn't bear the thought of leaving Shadow behind. He opened the window, looking into Shadow's bright, intelligent eyes, and said in a trembling voice, "I know, Shadow, I know, but I can't do anything." Shadow didn't give up. The horse continued to neigh loudly, as if urging Thomas to act, but Thomas, despite his desire to move, couldn't do so quickly. The floodwaters had already begun to seep into the house, bringing mud and debris with them. Thomas felt helpless, but he didn't want to give up. He looked at Shadow, his eyes filled with hope, as if waiting for a miracle. Shadow, with his intelligence and loyalty, seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The horse turned and ran out of the yard, disappearing into the rain. Thomas, watching Shadow's retreating figure, felt a pang of worry. He didn't know where the horse was going, but he trusted that Shadow wouldn't abandon him. In his heart, a small glimmer of hope began to flicker, even as the situation grew increasingly dire. Outside, the storm continued to rage, and the floodwaters showed no signs of stopping. The small, peaceful village was now engulfed in chaos. But amidst it all, Shadow was racing through the rain, carrying a mission that only this brave horse could undertake. And in the small wooden house, Thomas, though trapped, held on to his faith in his loyal companion. The storm was not just a test for the village, but also a trial of Shadow's loyalty and courage. And in the most dangerous moments, the bond between Thomas and Shadow would be proven, becoming a story the village would never forget. The storm raged on, and the floodwaters continued to rise, sweeping away everything in their path. Houses near the small river, once peaceful homes for many families, were now reduced to floating debris on the raging waters. The familiar roads of the village had disappeared, replaced by murky, turbulent streams. The sound of rain, wind, and rushing water merged into a chaotic symphony, engulfing the small village in turmoil. The villagers, though accustomed to heavy rains, had never faced a flood as devastating as this. They hurriedly evacuated to higher ground, carrying whatever they could save, a few valuable belongings, some food, and their loved ones. But not everyone was fortunate enough to escape the floodwaters. Some were trapped in their homes, unable to leave as the water rose too quickly. Cries for help echoed throughout the village, but there was little anyone could do except try to protect themselves. On the outskirts of the village, Thomas's wooden house was now completely surrounded by floodwaters. The water poured into the house, rising to knee level, carrying mud and debris. Thomas, sitting on his old chair, watched the rising water with growing concern. He knew he couldn't escape on his own and he didn't want to leave Shadow behind. But he also understood that in this situation, no one could come to rescue him. The current was too strong, and no one would risk their lives to reach such a dangerous place. Shadow, standing outside the house, looked at the floodwaters with determined eyes. The horse was unlike other animals, who would simply cower in fear and seek shelter. Shadow understood that Thomas was in danger, and if no one helped, he wouldn't survive. But Shadow also knew that no one in the village could come to their aid. The current was too fierce, and everyone was busy protecting their own families. In that moment, Shadow realized he had to act on his own. Without hesitation, Shadow plunged into the floodwaters. The icy, raging water battered against him, but the horse didn't falter. Powerful waves crashed against Shadow's body, trying to sweep him away, but with his strength and determination, Shadow pressed forward. Every step was a battle, but Shadow didn't stop. In his mind, there was only one goal: to find help and save Thomas. The floodwaters were not only strong but also filled with dangers. Broken branches, debris from destroyed houses, and even large rocks carried by the current posed threats that could injure or even kill Shadow. But the horse showed no fear. Shadow skillfully dodged obstacles, using all his strength to fight against the current. Each time a wave knocked him down, Shadow got back up and continued moving forward. The villagers, watching from higher ground, saw Shadow struggling in the floodwaters. They were astonished by the horse's bravery. Some shouted, trying to call Shadow back, but the horse didn't stop. They couldn't understand why Shadow was risking his life, but deep down, a sense of admiration began to grow. Shadow wasn't just a horse. He was a warrior, a silent hero fighting to save his friend. After a long and arduous journey, Shadow finally reached the center of the village, where a group of villagers had gathered to figure out how to deal with the flood. The horse, soaked and covered in mud, neighed loudly, drawing everyone's attention. Shadow's neigh wasn't just a call, it was a plea for help. The villagers, though unsure of what was happening, realized that Shadow was trying to communicate something. An elderly man, recognizing Shadow as Thomas's horse, stepped forward and said, "That's Thomas's horse. He must be in danger." The others nodded in agreement. They knew Thomas lived alone on the outskirts of the village, where the floodwaters were rising the fastest. But the current was too strong, and no one dared to risk their lives to go there. Shadow, as if understanding their hesitation, neighed loudly again, his eyes filled with urgency. The horse turned, looking toward Thomas's house, then back at the villagers as if to say, "Follow me, he needs you." Shadow's determination made it impossible for the villagers to ignore him. A group of young men, equipped with ropes and a makeshift raft, decided to follow Shadow to rescue Thomas. Shadow led the way, plunging into the floodwaters once more. The horse didn't slow down, even though his body was exhausted from the long journey. The young men, inspired by Shadow's courage, pressed on as well. They knew time was running out, and if they didn't act quickly, Thomas might not survive. The floodwaters remained fierce, but with Shadow's guidance, the group reached Thomas's house. The old man, sitting on his chair, couldn't hide his surprise and emotion when he saw Shadow return with help. The young men quickly got Thomas onto the raft, and with Shadow's support, they began the journey back to safety. Shadow, though exhausted, never took his eyes off Thomas. The horse walked alongside the raft, his bright eyes seeming to say, "I promised to protect you, and I've kept my promise." In that moment, amidst the raging storm, the bond between Thomas and Shadow became a symbol of loyalty and courage. The heavy rain that lasted for days had turned the peaceful land into a chaotic scene. Familiar roads were now submerged in water, with strong currents carrying mud, debris, and fragments of everyday life. In the midst of this chaos, Shadow, a small dog with jet-black fur and bright, determined eyes, began a challenging journey to seek help. Shadow stood on a high mound, which used to be a small path leading into the village. Ahead of him, the floodwaters surged, carrying broken branches and trash. The sound of rushing water mixed with the howling wind through the bare trees, creating a fierce symphony of nature. But Shadow was not afraid. In his eyes, there was only determination. He knew he had to overcome everything to reach the neighboring village, where a rescue team was preparing to respond to the flood. Shadow started moving, carefully stepping on the flooded path. Floating leaves and branches on the water's surface were like invisible traps, ready to ensnare anyone who wasn't cautious. He leaped over a fallen tree, blocking the way, his small but agile legs helping him maintain balance on the slippery surface. Every step was a challenge, but Shadow didn't stop. When he reached a section of the road cut off by floodwaters, Shadow paused to observe. The rushing current ahead was like a giant snake, ready to swallow anything that fell into it. Shadow sniffed the air, his ears perked up to listen. He knew he couldn't turn back, as behind him was his village, where the people were trapped and in need of help. Shadow took a deep breath and plunged into the water. The icy water engulfed Shadow's small body. The strong current pushed him downstream for a moment, but Shadow quickly regained his balance. He used all his strength to swim against the current, his legs paddling tirelessly. At one point, a large branch floated past and nearly hit him, but Shadow swiftly dodged to the side. Every second was a battle against nature, but Shadow refused to give up. As he neared the other side, a sudden whirlpool appeared and pulled Shadow under. He was dragged down, the suffocating sensation overwhelming him. But in that moment, images of his village and its people flashed in his mind. Shadow struggled, his legs kicking harder than ever. Finally, he broke free from the whirlpool and swam to the shore. His body was soaked and exhausted, but his eyes still shone with determination. He knew he couldn't stop. After crossing the rushing waters, Shadow continued his journey. The road ahead was filled with obstacles, fallen trees, slippery mud, and deep puddles that were impossible to predict. At times, Shadow had to leap over a wide gap in the path, his small legs barely strong enough to land on the other side. But each time, Shadow reminded himself that he couldn't give up. Along the way, Shadow encountered a flock of birds trying to find shelter. The small birds chirped weakly, as if pleading for help. Shadow paused for a moment, looking at them with sympathetic eyes. But he knew he couldn't linger for too long. He barked once, as if to encourage them, and then continued on his way. As he approached the neighboring village, Shadow began to hear unfamiliar sounds. It was the sound of rescue vehicles, people talking, and even the blaring of warning sirens. Shadow's small heart beat faster. He knew he was close to his destination. Finally, after a long and arduous journey, Shadow reached the neighboring village. This village, situated on higher ground, was not as severely affected by the flood. Here, the rescue team was preparing equipment and vehicles to respond to the disaster. Large trucks were loaded with food and water, rescue boats were being inflated, and rescue workers in life jackets were busily working. Shadow ran toward a group of people, barking to get their attention. At first, they were surprised to see a small dog appear in the midst of this chaotic scene. But when they looked into Shadow's eyes, they realized he was trying to convey something. A man knelt down, gently stroking Shadow's head, and said, "This dog must have come from the village across the flood. Perhaps that place is in danger." Shadow barked again, as if to confirm it. The man quickly reported to the rescue team leader. Soon, a rescue team was dispatched, bringing the necessary equipment to head to Shadow's village. The small dog was placed on a truck where he could rest after his long journey. On the way back, Shadow lay on the truck's floor, his eyes half closed from exhaustion. But inside, a warm feeling spread through him. He knew he had done what needed to be done. His village would be saved, and the people would no longer face danger alone. As the rescue vehicles approached the village, Shadow lifted his head, his eyes shining brightly. He barked once, as if to signal that help had arrived. The villagers, upon seeing the rescue team, burst into joy and relief. They didn't know that it was a small dog who had brought them hope in their darkest hour. Shadow's journey was not just a battle against nature, but also a testament to courage and determination. In the midst of the storm, faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, a small dog became a hero, bringing light to the darkest days. The rain continued to pour relentlessly, and the floodwaters showed no signs of receding. The neighboring village, though situated on higher ground, was bustling with activity as the rescue team prepared to respond to the disaster. Trucks loaded with supplies, rescue boats, and workers in bright orange life jackets moved quickly, their voices blending with the sound of the rain and the occasional blaring of sirens. Amidst this chaos, Shadow, a black horse with a sleek coat and piercing eyes, stood at the edge of the village, his hooves stomping anxiously on the wet ground. He had made it through the treacherous floodwaters, but his mission was far from over. Shadow let out a loud, piercing neigh that echoed through the village. It was a sound filled with urgency, cutting through the noise of the rain and the commotion. The rescue workers paused for a moment, turning their heads toward the source of the sound. There, standing tall and drenched from the rain, was Shadow. His mane clung to his neck, and his body trembled slightly from exhaustion, but his eyes burned with determination. He neighed again, louder this time, as if trying to convey the importance of his message. At first, the rescue workers were confused. A horse appearing in the middle of a flood-stricken area was unusual enough, but the way Shadow was behaving was even more puzzling. He wasn't wandering aimlessly or seeking shelter like most animals would in such conditions. Instead, he seemed to be trying to get their attention. One of the workers, a young man named Daniel, approached Shadow cautiously, holding out his hand in a gesture of reassurance. "Hey there, boy," Daniel said softly, his voice barely audible over the rain. "What's wrong? Are you lost?" Shadow neighed again, stamping his hooves on the ground. He turned his head toward the direction of his village, then looked back at Daniel, his eyes pleading. He repeated the motion, turning and looking back, as if urging the man to follow him. Daniel furrowed his brow, unsure of what the horse was trying to communicate. "It's like he's trying to tell us something," Daniel muttered to himself. Other members of the rescue team began to gather around, curious about the commotion. "What's going on?" one of them asked. "Why is that horse acting so strange?" "I think he's trying to lead us somewhere," Daniel replied, still watching Shadow's movements closely. Shadow neighed again, this time more urgently, and took a few steps toward the flooded path leading out of the village. He stopped, turned his head back to the group, and neighed once more. It was as if he was saying, "Follow me." The rescue workers exchanged skeptical glances. "It's just a horse," one of them said. "Maybe it's scared or lost. We don't have time to chase after animals right now." But Daniel shook his head. "No, look at him. He's not just wandering around. He's trying to show us something. I think we should follow him." The team leader, a seasoned rescuer named Sarah, stepped forward. She studied Shadow for a moment, her sharp eyes taking in the horse's behavior. "Animals have instincts," she said thoughtfully. "Sometimes they know things we don't. If this horse is trying to lead us somewhere, it might be worth checking out." Shadow neighed again, as if to emphasize her point. Sarah nodded decisively. "All right, we'll send a small team to follow him. Daniel, you're in charge. Take a boat and the necessary equipment. If this horse is leading us to something important, we need to be ready." Daniel's face lit up with determination. "Yes, ma'am," he said, quickly gathering a team of 3 other rescuers. They loaded a small inflatable boat with ropes, life vests, and other rescue tools, then turned to Shadow. "All right, boy," Daniel said, patting the horse's neck. "Lead the way." Shadow neighed in response and immediately began trotting toward the flooded path. The rescuers followed closely behind, their boots splashing through the shallow water as they pulled the boat along. The rain continued to fall, and the path ahead was muddy and treacherous, but Shadow moved with purpose, his hooves finding solid ground with remarkable precision. Every few steps, he would glance back to make sure the rescuers were still following him, his eyes filled with urgency. As they moved further away from the village, the water grew deeper, and the current became stronger. The rescuers climbed into the boat, paddling carefully to keep up with Shadow, who waded through the water with determination. The sight was both surreal and inspiring, a lone horse leading a team of humans through the flood, his every movement guided by an unshakable sense of purpose. The journey was not without its challenges. At one point, the group encountered a fallen tree blocking their path. The massive trunk, carried by the floodwaters, had wedged itself between 2 large rocks, creating an impassable barrier. Shadow stopped in his tracks, his ears twitching as he assessed the situation. He neighed softly, as if thinking, then turned and began to climb a small, slippery embankment to the side of the path. The rescuers watched in amazement as the horse navigated the steep incline with surprising agility. "Looks like he's found a way around," Daniel said, steering the boat toward the embankment. The team followed Shadow's lead, carefully maneuvering the boat over the uneven terrain. Once they were past the obstacle, Shadow returned to the flooded path, his pace quickening as if he knew they were getting closer to their destination. As they continued, the rescuers began to notice signs of the devastation Shadow was leading them toward. Broken branches and debris floated past them, and the water carried a faint but unmistakable smell of mud and decay. The rescuers exchanged uneasy glances, their sense of urgency growing. Whatever Shadow was leading them to, it was clear that time was of the essence. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Shadow stopped. He stood at the edge of a wide expanse of water, his body tense and his ears perked up. He neighed loudly, the sound echoing across the flooded landscape. The rescuers looked around, trying to see what had caught the horse's attention. "There!" one of them shouted, pointing toward a cluster of rooftops barely visible above the water. It was the village Shadow had come from, now almost completely submerged. The rescuers could see faint movements on one of the rooftops, people waving frantically for help. Daniel's heart sank at the sight. "We need to move fast," he said, his voice firm. "Get the boat ready. We're going in." The team sprang into action, unloading the boat and preparing to navigate the flooded village. Shadow stood by, his body trembling with exhaustion, but his eyes never leaving the rescuers. He had done his part, leading them to the people who needed help. Now, it was up to the humans to finish the job. As the rescuers paddled toward the rooftops, Shadow let out one final triumphant neigh. It was a sound of relief, of victory, and of hope. The people on the rooftops heard it and turned their heads, their faces lighting up with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. They didn't know how or why the horse had brought the rescuers to them, but in that moment, Shadow became a symbol of courage and determination. The rescue operation was long and arduous, but thanks to Shadow's guidance, the team was able to save everyone trapped in the village. When the last person was safely aboard the boat, Daniel turned to look at Shadow, who was standing on the embankment, watching them with quiet pride. "You're a hero, boy," Daniel said softly, tipping his hat to the horse. Shadow neighed in response, his eyes shining with a quiet, unspoken understanding. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and the floodwaters continued to rise, swallowing everything in their path. The once familiar village roads were now rivers of muddy, rushing water, carrying debris and remnants of daily life. Shadow, the black horse with a sleek coat and determined eyes, stood at the edge of the rescue team's boat, his body tense and his ears perked up. He had led the team this far, but the most dangerous part of the mission was still ahead. The village he had come from was now almost completely submerged, and time was running out for those still trapped inside. The rescue team, led by Daniel and Sarah, paddled carefully through the floodwaters, following Shadow's lead. The horse waded through the water with remarkable precision, his hooves finding solid ground even in the murky depths. Every so often he would stop, turn his head back to the team, and neigh softly, as if urging them to hurry. The rescuers, though exhausted from the journey, pushed forward with renewed determination. They knew that Shadow's urgency meant lives were at stake. As they approached the outskirts of the village, the devastation became even more apparent. Houses were partially submerged, their rooftops barely visible above the water. Trees had been uprooted, their massive trunks lying across what used to be roads. The sound of rushing water was deafening, and the air was thick with the smell of mud and decay. Shadow stopped for a moment, his ears twitching as he listened intently. Then, with a loud neigh, he began moving again, his pace quickening as he led the team deeper into the flooded village. Inside a small wooden house on the edge of the village, Thomas was clinging to the last remnants of hope. The elderly man, frail and exhausted, sat on a chair that he had placed on top of a table, trying to stay above the rising water. The flood had already filled most of his home, and the cold, muddy water lapped at the legs of the table, threatening to engulf him completely. His breaths were shallow, and his hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the chair for support. He had tried to escape earlier, but his weak legs and the strong current outside had made it impossible. Now all he could do was wait and pray that someone would come to save him. Shadow's image flashed in his mind, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to hope. If only Shadow made it out, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the sound of the water. Maybe he'll bring help. But as the minutes dragged on, Thomas's strength began to fade. The cold seeped into his bones and his vision blurred. He closed his eyes, his head drooping forward, as the water continued to rise around him. Meanwhile, Shadow had reached the heart of the village. He stopped abruptly, his body tense and his ears swiveling as he listened for any signs of life. The rescuers, now navigating their boat through the narrow, debris-filled streets, watched him closely. "He's looking for something," Daniel said, his voice low. "Or someone." Shadow let out a loud, piercing neigh that echoed through the flooded village. The sound cut through the noise of the rushing water, carrying with it a sense of urgency and desperation. For a moment there was silence, and then faintly, the rescuers heard a weak cry for help. "There!" Sarah shouted, pointing toward a partially submerged house in the distance. "It's coming from over there!" Shadow neighed again and began moving toward the house, his movements quick and purposeful. The rescuers paddled after him, their boat cutting through the water as fast as they could manage. As they drew closer, they could see the house more clearly. The water had risen almost to the roof, and the windows were shattered, allowing the flood to pour in freely. Inside, they could just make out the figure of an elderly man, sitting on a chair atop a table, his head slumped forward. "It's Thomas!" Daniel exclaimed, recognizing the man. "We have to get to him now." The rescuers maneuvered the boat as close to the house as they could, but the strong current made it difficult to keep the vessel steady. Shadow, sensing the urgency, waded into the deeper water, positioning himself near the house. He neighed loudly, as if calling out to Thomas, but the man didn't respond. His body was motionless, and the water was dangerously close to reaching him. "We're running out of time," Sarah shouted. "Daniel, grab the rope. We'll need to pull him out quickly." Daniel secured a rope around his waist and prepared to enter the water. "Hold the boat steady," he called to the others. With a deep breath, he plunged into the cold, muddy water, fighting against the current as he made his way toward the house. Shadow stood nearby, his eyes fixed on Thomas, as if willing the man to hold on just a little longer. When Daniel reached the house, he climbed onto the table and gently shook Thomas's shoulder. "Thomas, can you hear me? We're here to help," he said urgently. The old man stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. For a moment he seemed disoriented, but then recognition dawned in his eyes. "Shadow," he whispered weakly. He brought you." Daniel smiled, relief flooding through him. "Yes, he did, but we need to get you out of here now. Can you hold on to me?" Thomas nodded weakly, and with great effort Daniel helped him climb onto his back. The old man was light, but the water made every movement a struggle. As Daniel waded back toward the boat, the current grew stronger, threatening to pull them both under. Shadow, sensing the danger, moved closer, positioning himself alongside Daniel to provide support. The horse's presence gave Daniel the strength he needed to push forward, and together, they made it back to the boat. The rescuers quickly pulled Thomas aboard, wrapping him in a blanket to keep him warm. "We've got him," Sarah said, her voice filled with relief. "But we need to move. The water's rising fast." Shadow neighed again, his ears swiveling as he listened for any other cries for help. The rescuers followed his gaze and spotted another house in the distance, where a family of 3 was trapped on the roof. Without hesitation, Shadow began leading the way, his movements steady and confident despite the treacherous conditions. Over the next hour, the rescue team, guided by Shadow, managed to save several more villagers who had been stranded by the flood. Each rescue was a race against time, as the water continued to rise and the current grew stronger. Shadow never faltered, his determination unwavering as he led the team from one house to the next. His loud, piercing neighs became a beacon of hope for those still trapped, guiding the rescuers to their locations. By the time the team returned to the neighboring village, the boat was filled with rescued villagers, all of whom owed their lives to the brave black horse. Thomas, now wrapped in a thick blanket and sitting beside Shadow, reached out to stroke the horse's wet mane. "You saved us, boy," he said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. "You're a hero." Shadow neighed softly in response, his eyes shining with quiet pride. He had done what he set out to do, and though his body was exhausted, his spirit remained strong. The villagers, rescue workers, and even the children who had been saved looked at Shadow with awe and admiration. In their eyes, he was not just a horse, he was a symbol of courage, determination, and hope. As the rain finally began to ease and the floodwaters slowly receded, Shadow stood tall, his black coat glistening in the faint light of the sun breaking through the clouds. He had faced the storm and emerged victorious, proving that even in the darkest of times, a single act of bravery could make all the difference. The storm had finally passed, and the floodwaters began to recede, leaving behind a village battered but not broken. The once familiar streets were now covered in mud and debris, and the houses bore the scars of the relentless flood. Yet, amidst the destruction, there was a sense of relief and gratitude. The villagers, though shaken, were alive, and they owed much of that to a black horse named Shadow. As the sun rose over the village for the first time in days, its golden light illuminated the aftermath of the disaster. People emerged from their homes, some still trembling from the ordeal, but their faces carried a glimmer of hope. They began the arduous task of cleaning up, salvaging what they could, and rebuilding their lives. But as they worked, one story was repeated over and over again: the story of Shadow, the horse who had braved the flood to save lives. In the days following the flood, Shadow became the center of attention. Villagers gathered around Thomas's small wooden house, where Shadow now stood in the stable, his sleek black coat glistening in the sunlight. Children peeked through the stable door, their eyes wide with wonder, while adults shared the tale of Shadow's bravery. "Did you hear? Shadow led the rescue team straight to Thomas's house," one villager said, his voice filled with awe. "And not just Thomas," another added. "He guided them to other families too. Without him, who knows how many of us would have been lost." The story spread quickly, not just within the village but to neighboring areas as well. Shadow was no longer just a horse, he was a hero, a symbol of courage and loyalty in the face of disaster. Thomas, who had been rescued just in time, was now resting in his home. Though his body was weak from the ordeal, his spirit was stronger than ever. He sat by the window watching Shadow in the stable. The horse was calm, munching on a pile of fresh hay that the villagers had brought as a token of their gratitude. Thomas's eyes filled with emotion as he thought about what Shadow had done. For years, Shadow had been more than just a horse to Thomas. He was a companion, a source of comfort in the quiet, lonely days of old age. But now Thomas realized that Shadow was much more than that. He was a friend, a protector, and a being with a heart as big as the mountains that surrounded their village. Thomas called out softly, "Shadow." The horse lifted his head, his ears twitching at the sound of his name. He trotted over to the stable door, his dark eyes meeting Thomas's. In that moment, no words were needed. The bond between them was unspoken but unbreakable. Despite his frailty, Thomas insisted on visiting Shadow every day. With the help of a kind neighbor, he made his way to the stable, carrying a small bucket of apples or carrots as a treat for the horse. Shadow would greet him with a soft nicker, lowering his head so Thomas could stroke his mane. "You're not just a horse, you know," Thomas said one morning, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're my family, my friend. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you've done." Shadow nudged Thomas gently, as if to say that no repayment was needed. For Shadow, saving Thomas and the others had not been a choice. It was simply what he had to do. His loyalty and love for Thomas had driven him to act, and that was enough. The villagers, too, wanted to show their gratitude to Shadow. They organized a small celebration in his honor, a way to thank the horse who had become their hero. On the day of the event, people gathered in the village square, bringing food, music, and laughter. Shadow was brought to the center of the square, where he stood tall and proud, his black coat shining in the sunlight. Children ran up to him with flowers, which they wove into a garland and placed around his neck. Adults patted his back and spoke words of thanks, their voices filled with genuine admiration. Even the rescue team, who had witnessed Shadow's bravery firsthand, returned to the village to pay their respects. Daniel, one of the rescuers, stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "I've worked in rescue missions for years," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I've never seen anything like what Shadow did. He didn't just save Thomas, he saved all of us. He reminded us of the power of loyalty, courage, and love. Shadow is more than a hero, he's an inspiration." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the village. Shadow, though unaware of the full meaning of their words, seemed to understand that he was being honored. He neighed softly, his ears flicking back and forth as if acknowledging their gratitude. As the days turned into weeks, life in the village slowly returned to normal. The houses were repaired, the streets were cleared, and the fields began to show signs of new growth. But the memory of the flood and Shadow's heroism remained fresh in everyone's minds. Thomas, though still recovering, found a renewed sense of purpose. He spent his days caring for Shadow, ensuring that the horse was well fed and comfortable. In return, Shadow stayed close to Thomas, always watching over him like a guardian. One evening, as the sun set over the village, Thomas sat on a bench outside his house, with Shadow standing beside him. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and the air was filled with the sounds of birds returning to their nests. Thomas reached out and placed a hand on Shadow's neck, his touch gentle but firm. "You know, Shadow," he said, his voice soft but steady, "I've lived a long life. I've seen good times and bad, joy and sorrow. But I've never seen anything as extraordinary as you. You've given me hope, not just for myself but for this whole village. You've shown us what it means to be brave, to care for others, and to never give up." Shadow turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Thomas's. In that moment, it was as if the horse understood every word. He nuzzled Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of affection that brought tears to the old man's eyes. The story of Shadow continued to be told, not just in the village but in the surrounding areas as well. Travelers who passed through the village would often stop to see the famous black horse, and they would leave with stories of their own to share. Shadow became a symbol of hope and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times there is always light to be found. For Thomas, Shadow was more than a hero. He was a reminder of the beauty of life, the strength of love, and the power of friendship. As the seasons changed and the village flourished once more, Thomas knew that he had been given a gift, a bond with a creature whose heart was as vast and unyielding as the mountains themselves. And so, Shadow lived on, not just as a horse, but as a legend, a hero, and a friend. His story would be told for generations, a testament to the courage and loyalty that can change lives and bring hope to even the most broken of hearts. The storm was now a distant memory, and the village had slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. The streets, once submerged in muddy floodwaters, were now dry and bustling with life. The fields, though scarred by the disaster, began to show signs of recovery, with fresh green shoots sprouting from the soil. The villagers worked tirelessly to rebuild their homes and their lives, but amidst the quiet hum of daily life, one figure stood out, Shadow, the black horse who had become the village's hero. For Thomas, life had taken on a new meaning. The elderly man, who had once spent his days in solitude, now found himself surrounded by warmth and gratitude. Shadow had not only saved his life, but it also brought him closer to the people around him. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, Thomas would step outside his small wooden house and make his way to the stable where Shadow waited. The horse would greet him with a soft nicker, his dark eyes filled with a quiet intelligence that never failed to comfort Thomas. Thomas had always cared for Shadow, but now, his devotion to the horse was deeper than ever. He spent hours brushing Shadow's sleek black coat, ensuring it shone in the sunlight. He cleaned the stable meticulously, making sure it was always dry and comfortable. Every day, he brought Shadow fresh hay and water, along with treats like apples and carrots. "You deserve the best, my friend," Thomas would say, his voice filled with affection. Shadow, in turn, would nuzzle Thomas's shoulder or gently rest his head against the old man's chest, a silent expression of their unbreakable bond. Caring for Shadow became more than just a routine for Thomas. It became a way for him to express his gratitude. Each stroke of the brush, each handful of hay, was a reminder of the life Shadow had given back to him. Thomas often found himself talking to the horse, sharing his thoughts and memories. "You know, Shadow," he said one afternoon as he sat on a stool outside the stable, "I used to think my best days were behind me, but you've shown me that there's still so much to live for. You've given me a reason to wake up every morning." Shadow flicked his ears and let out a soft snort, as if he understood every word. Thomas chuckled, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The villagers, too, had not forgotten Shadow's heroism. They often stopped by Thomas's house to visit the horse, bringing with them small gifts, carrots, apples, and even handmade garlands of flowers. Children in particular were drawn to Shadow. They would gather around the stable, their laughter filling the air as they reached out to pet the horse's nose or feed him treats. Shadow, ever gentle and patient, stood still as the children fussed over him, his dark eyes watching them with quiet curiosity. "Shadow is not just a horse," one villager said during a visit. "He's a part of our community now. He's a reminder of what we can achieve when we work together and care for one another." Thomas, who had always been a private man, found himself opening his home and his heart to the villagers. He welcomed their visits, sharing stories about Shadow and the bond they shared. For the first time in years, Thomas felt truly connected to the people around him. The loneliness that had once weighed heavily on his shoulders was replaced by a sense of belonging. One sunny afternoon, a group of villagers gathered outside Thomas's house to celebrate the completion of the village's reconstruction. They brought food, music, and laughter, turning the occasion into a small festival. Shadow was, of course, the guest of honor. The villagers adorned him with a garland of fresh flowers and tied colorful ribbons to his mane. Shadow stood tall and proud, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight as the villagers clapped and cheered. Thomas watched the scene with a smile, his heart swelling with pride. He had always known Shadow was special, but seeing how much the horse meant to the entire village filled him with a deep sense of fulfillment. As the festivities continued, Thomas found himself surrounded by people who wanted to hear his story, how Shadow had saved him, how the horse had led the rescue team through the flood, and how their bond had grown stronger in the days since. For Thomas, sharing these stories was not just about recounting the past, it was about celebrating the present. Shadow had not only saved his life but had also given him a new purpose. Through the horse, Thomas had found a way to connect with others, to open his heart and let people in. As the weeks turned into months, Thomas and Shadow settled into a peaceful routine. Every morning, Thomas would take Shadow out to the fields, where the horse could run freely. Watching Shadow gallop across the open land, his mane flowing in the wind, was a sight that never failed to bring a smile to Thomas's face. "You're free now," Thomas would say, his voice soft, "free to live the life you deserve." In the afternoons, Thomas would sit outside his house carving small wooden figures of animals, a hobby he had picked up in his younger days but had abandoned over the years. Shadow often stood nearby, grazing or simply keeping Thomas company. The two of them shared a quiet companionship, a bond that needed no words. The villagers continued to visit, bringing gifts and sharing stories. They often invited Thomas to join them for meals or community events, and though he had once been hesitant to accept such invitations, he now found himself saying yes more often. Shadow had taught him the value of connection, of being part of something larger than himself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Thomas sat on a bench outside his house, with Shadow standing beside him. The air was cool and filled with the sounds of crickets chirping and birds returning to their nests. Thomas reached out and placed a hand on Shadow's neck, his touch gentle but firm. "You know, Shadow," he said, his voice tinged with emotion, "I used to think I was just waiting for the end, but you've shown me that life is still full of surprises. You've given me a reason to keep going, to keep living, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Shadow turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Thomas's. In that moment, it was as if the horse understood every word. He nuzzled Thomas's shoulder, a gesture of affection that brought tears to the old man's eyes. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Thomas and Shadow sat together in the quiet of the evening. The world around them was calm, the chaos of the flood now a distant memory. For Thomas, these moments of peace were a gift, a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had to be thankful for. Shadow, the horse who had once been just a companion, was now a symbol of hope, courage, and love. Through him, Thomas had found a new lease on life, and the village had found a hero. Together, they faced each day with a sense of purpose and gratitude, knowing that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And so, life in the village continued, marked by the quiet strength of a man and his horse, and the enduring bond that had brought them, and their community, through the darkest of times. The village had fully recovered from the devastating flood, and life had returned to its peaceful rhythm. The fields were green again, the houses repaired, and the streets once more filled with the sounds of laughter and chatter. Yet, amidst the normalcy, the memory of the flood and the hero who had saved so many lives remained vivid in everyone's hearts. Shadow, the black horse who had braved the storm and led the rescue team to save Thomas and others, had become a symbol of hope and courage for the entire village. The villagers, grateful for Shadow's bravery, wanted to do something special to honor him. One evening, as they gathered in the village square, an idea was proposed. They would build a statue of Shadow in the center of the square. It would serve as a permanent reminder of his heroism and the bond between humans and animals. The idea was met with unanimous approval, and plans for the statue began immediately. The village square, a bustling hub of activity, was chosen as the site for the statue. It was a place where people gathered for festivals, markets, and celebrations, and the villagers agreed that it was the perfect location to honor Shadow. A local sculptor, known for his skill in capturing the essence of his subjects, was tasked with creating the statue. He spent days observing Shadow, studying the horse's posture, his movements, and the quiet intelligence in his eyes. Shadow, as always, stood patiently as the sculptor sketched and measured. The villagers often gathered around to watch the process, their excitement growing with each passing day. Children whispered to each other about how the statue would look, while adults shared stories of Shadow's bravery during the flood. "He's not just a horse," one villager said. "He's a part of our history now." The sculptor worked tirelessly, pouring his heart into the project. He wanted the statue to capture not just Shadow's physical appearance, but also the spirit of the horse, the courage, loyalty, and determination that had made him a hero. After weeks of hard work, the statue was finally complete. It was a magnificent piece, depicting Shadow standing tall and proud, his head held high and his eyes bright with determination. The sculptor had managed to capture every detail, from the sleekness of Shadow's coat to the strength in his stance. The day of the statue's unveiling was declared a village holiday. People from neighboring villages came to witness the event, eager to see the tribute to the horse whose story had inspired so many. The square was decorated with colorful banners and flowers, and a stage was set up for the ceremony. Shadow, the guest of honor, was brought to the square, his black coat gleaming in the sunlight. He stood calmly beside Thomas, who held his reins with a steady hand. Thomas, though frail, had insisted on being part of the ceremony. Shadow was not just a hero to the village, he was Thomas's closest companion, the one who had saved his life and given him a renewed sense of purpose. As the crowd gathered, Thomas looked around, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He had never imagined that his horse would become such an important figure in the lives of so many people. The ceremony began with speeches from the village elders, who recounted the events of the flood and Shadow's role in saving lives. They spoke of his bravery, his intelligence, and his unwavering loyalty. "Shadow is more than a horse," one elder said. "He is a symbol of what we can achieve when we act with courage and compassion. He reminds us that even in the darkest times, there is always hope." As the speeches concluded, the sculptor stepped forward to unveil the statue. With a flourish, he pulled away the cloth covering the sculpture, revealing the magnificent figure of Shadow. The crowd erupted into applause and cheers, their voices echoing through the square. The statue stood tall and proud, just like the horse it represented. Shadow's likeness was so lifelike that it seemed as if the statue might come to life at any moment. The villagers gathered around the statue, marveling at its beauty and the skill of the sculptor. Children pointed excitedly, while adults nodded in approval. "It's perfect," one villager said. "It's exactly how I remember him during the flood, strong, fearless, and full of life." Thomas, standing beside Shadow, felt a lump rise in his throat as he looked at the statue. The sight of Shadow, immortalized in stone, brought back a flood of memories. The fear and desperation of the flood, the moment Shadow had appeared with the rescue team, and the bond that had grown between them in the days that followed. Tears welled up in his eyes, and he reached out to place a hand on Shadow's neck. "You see that, boy?" Thomas said, his voice trembling with emotion. "That's you. That's what you mean to all of us." Shadow turned his head, his dark eyes meeting Thomas's. In that moment, it was as if the horse understood the significance of the statue and the love that surrounded him. He nuzzled Thomas's shoulder gently, a gesture that brought a smile to the old man's face. Thomas wiped away a tear and looked back at the statue. "You didn't just save me, Shadow," he said softly. "You saved my heart. You gave me a reason to keep going, to believe in life again. And now, you've given this whole village something to believe in." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the square, the villagers lit candles and placed them around the base of the statue. The soft light illuminated Shadow's likeness, making it seem even more lifelike. The crowd grew quiet, their voices replaced by the gentle flicker of the flames and the sound of the evening breeze. Thomas sat on a bench near the statue, with Shadow standing beside him. He watched as the villagers paid their respects, some bowing their heads in silent gratitude, others placing flowers at the base of the statue. It was a moment of unity, a reminder of the strength and resilience that had carried them through the flood. For Thomas, the statue was more than just a tribute to Shadow. It was a symbol of the bond they shared, a bond that had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined. As he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the community and the presence of his beloved horse, Thomas felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in years. In the days that followed, the statue became a gathering place for the villagers. Children played around it, adults stopped to admire it, and visitors from other villages came to see the famous horse who had become a legend. Shadow, unaware of the full extent of his fame, continued to live his life as he always had, by Thomas's side, loyal and steadfast. For Thomas, every glance at the statue was a reminder of the journey they had been on together. It was a reminder of the courage and love that had brought them through the darkest of times and into the light. And as he looked at Shadow, standing tall and proud beside him. Thomas knew that their story was far from over. Together they would face whatever the future held, their bond unbroken and their hearts full of gratitude. Years passed, but the story of Shadow, the brave black horse, continued to live on in the hearts of the villagers. From the early days after the flood, when Shadow was honored as a hero, to the peaceful years that followed, his proud image became an irreplaceable symbol of the small village. The story of Shadow was not just a memory, it became a legacy passed down from generation to generation. The children of the village grew up hearing the story of Shadow. Every evening as the fire crackled in their small homes, parents would tell their children about the horse who had saved the entire village during the devastating flood. Shadow wasn't just a horse, they would say. He was a symbol of loyalty, courage, and love. The children listened with wide eyes, imagining a strong black horse with bright star-like eyes, leading the way through the raging floodwaters to save those in danger. The statue of Shadow, standing tall in the central square, became a place where people often gathered. The elderly came to remember, children came to play, and visitors from neighboring villages came to hear the story of the legendary horse. The statue was not just a piece of art, it was a reminder of the values Shadow had left behind: loyalty, courage, and the boundless friendship between humans and animals. In his final years, Shadow lived surrounded by the love and care of Thomas and the villagers. Though age slowed his steps, Shadow's eyes still held the same intelligence and gentleness as always. Thomas, now old and frail himself, spent every day caring for Shadow. He no longer had the strength for heavy work, but caring for Shadow was the greatest joy of his life. Every morning, Thomas would lead Shadow to the fields, where the horse could graze peacefully and enjoy the warm sunlight. Thomas often sat on an old wooden chair, watching Shadow wander through the lush green grass, his heart filled with peace. "You've given me a new life, Shadow," Thomas would say, his voice warm and full of emotion. "I'll spend the rest of my days thanking you." The villagers, too, never forgot Shadow. They often brought small gifts, carrots, apples, or the freshest bundles of hay, for the horse. The children, even though they had heard the story of Shadow hundreds of times, were always excited to visit the legendary horse. Shadow, with his gentle nature, stood still as the children petted him and fed him treats. He was not just a part of the village, he was its heart. But time waits for no one, and even heroes cannot escape the laws of nature. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves fell across the village paths, Shadow could no longer muster the strength to stand. Thomas, realizing that the time to say goodbye had come, sat beside the horse, his trembling hands gently stroking Shadow's sleek black coat, which had once been the pride of the entire village. "You've lived a truly meaningful life, Shadow," Thomas said, his voice breaking with emotion. "You didn't just save me, you saved my heart. You taught me to love, to hope, and to see that this life still holds so much beauty." Shadow, as if understanding Thomas's words, stirred slightly and let out a soft, gentle sigh. His eyes, though tired, shone with peace. Thomas stayed by Shadow's side all day, recounting the memories they had shared, from their earliest days together to the unforgettable moments during the flood. As the sun set, Shadow closed his eyes for the last time, leaving this world surrounded by love and peace. Though heartbroken, Thomas knew that Shadow deserved to rest in a special place. He chose the largest tree in the village, where Shadow often stood to rest on quiet afternoons. With the help of the villagers, Thomas buried Shadow beneath the tree and placed a small stone marker engraved with the words, "Shadow, the hero of the village, a symbol of loyalty and courage." The farewell ceremony for Shadow was a deeply emotional event. The entire village gathered under the tree, each person bringing a flower to place on the horse's grave. The children, though too young to fully understand the loss, stood quietly beside their parents, their eyes glistening with tears. Thomas, standing before Shadow's grave, spoke his final words. "You will always live in my heart, Shadow, and I know you will live forever in the heart of this village." After Shadow's passing, his statue in the central square became more sacred than ever. The villagers regularly cleaned and decorated the statue, placing fresh flowers at its base as a way to honor the horse. Every village festival began with a gathering around the statue, where parents would recount Shadow's story to their children. The story of Shadow was not just a part of the village's history, it became a valuable lesson about loyalty, courage, and friendship. The children who grew up with this story carried it with them throughout their lives, and when they became adults, they passed it on to their own children, ensuring that Shadow's legacy would endure for generations. Thomas, now in his twilight years, often visited Shadow's grave. He brought wildflowers he had picked from the fields and placed them beneath the great tree where Shadow rested. Each time he stood before the grave, he felt as though Shadow was still by his side, just as he had been in the old days. "You've left behind a great legacy, Shadow," Thomas said during one of his visits. "Not just for me, but for this entire village. You've taught us to love, to hope, and to find light even in the darkest times." And so the story of Shadow continued to live on. His statue still stood tall in the central square, a constant reminder of the values he had embodied. The great tree where Shadow was buried became a place of reflection and remembrance, where villagers often came to pay their respects. And in the hearts of everyone in the village, Shadow was not just a horse, he was a hero, a friend, and a symbol of all that was good and noble in life.